Well, I must say that I'm very grateful to the organizers, Oriol and Albert, and especially to Montserrat, that has been the one who invited me to join this group. My presentation, although it's, I will talk in English actually, but the slides are all in Spanish. And it is because it is a summary of 3 1.5-hour conferences that I had to put together and summarize in 40 minutes. So I hope we can deal with that. And afterwards, we are going to have the possibility of making some conversation related to this. This is a presentation that is not related to actually the main topic of Iran, but it is a conceptual conference. And it is because Montserrat wanted me to clarify many of the subjects that we deal with. So I selected some of them because I didn't have enough time for going on with all this. So in the Spanish, it's called the Resiliencia Seismic, as we saw before. It's a seismic resilience in cultural heritage, disaster prevention, preparation, and recovery. And we'll deal with, first of all, the patrimonio cultural, which is cultural heritage, because one of the examples I'm going to present is in El Salvador. That was an experience that I would like to share with you because I was part of the Unesco mission after the earthquake. So it's a post-disaster evaluation, and it was very interesting because it was the very first time that United Nations included the cultural heritage in the assessment of post-disaster evaluation. So the cultural heritage is very important for any society because it's not only a product, but it's a process that gives to the society an amount of resources that are inherited from the past, and it creates in the present, and they go ahead with the new generations. And so it's very important to keep them alive, and to study them. And all this information comes here, as you can see, here. Oh. Okay, here. Are part of the UNESCO indicators for cultural development, and you can find it, if you want, we can talk about that afterwards, and I'll give you the references where all this information is. In Spanish, we have the fact that we have all these terms actually for talking about earthquakes. And so always there is a fact that what is a terremoto? Is a strong one, is a light one, what is temblor? But all of them are synonymous. The same thing is with earthquakes and ground motion, and we can say ground shaking also, and there are other technical concepts. Then there is something else that many people say, you are a seismologist. Now, let's explain that seismology is the study of the ground, and usually are the geologists and the seismologists that study the phenomenon of the earthquake. Though the earthquake-resistant design or engineering is the part of the engineer that studies actually the possibility of mitigation of the effects of earthquakes. And in here, I always say, you know, seismology is from the surface down, and seismic design is from the surface up. So it's not only engineers, all the branches of engineer but the architects. So I hope architects are aware of the importance of architectural design in earthquake-prone areas. So and then we come here to the resiliencia. Resilience, that is a word that is being used, but not many people know exactly what it is. There are many definitions, and here we have some of this definition comes from a glossary of terms, and it is the capacity. That's important to understand, that is the capacity of a society or community for reacting against the effects of an earthquake. And this is very important, what we are mentioning here. It's not only for reacting for the effects of an earthquake, but for recovering once the event has passed. And although they can have difficult situations, it has to come up positively and transformed for the experience, and with the capacity of adapt to the new situation. Because resilience in terms of civil engineering means how it reacts, how a building reacts after an earthquake, and it's supposed to be equal exactly as the building was before. But in social terms, that is where this concept has been developed, means that probably the society or the buildings are not able to restore their initial form or capacity of dealing with the earthquake, but this part is what is really important. That didn't collapse, people didn't die, but they are able to recover, not only to recover, but to transform to the new situation. All that we have seen here with the Iranian earthquake is that, it means how do you recover? How do you deal with all these temporary housing, the infrastructure, all the lifelines? What happens with all that? So it is very important to deal with resilience and to study resilience and to understand the concept. So then we have this disaster, seismic disaster. And the definition is a disaster occurs when in a place, region, or country is not able to respond with their own means. So that's the reason there are different scales of disaster. We can have the regional disaster. We can have a national disaster. And then we can have even an international disaster with the leakage of oil, for example, that has affect different countries. It's an international disaster. A national disaster is when the country is not able to recover. And then we'll continue with that, but we'll see it. And so it means that there is a disaster when the need for immediate assistance is required. And this is the most important part. So a disaster doesn't exist until the president or the chancellor or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs declare the disaster. Before that, it's not a disaster. At that moment, the country asked the United Nations to come with all the branches of the United Nations to make assessment and then to go to the table, negotiation table, in order to get the money from donors. That sometimes the donors, as you can live, are not actually donors, are people interested economically on getting a part of the cake. So here we have an example of the declaration of catastrophe zone. And this is the president of Chile after the earthquake in 2010. And until she didn't call the United Nations, that was not a disaster. But once, you know, it's what I say, the president or the chancellor are the ones who, oops. So let's go back to terremoto and the concepts. Is an earthquake a disaster? Is always an earthquake is a disaster? What do you think? Is it? But that's what we think. Earthquake, disaster. No, an earthquake by itself is not a disaster. So here, for example, if we have an earthquake in here, would it be a disaster? No, we don't have a disaster. So we'll check it and we'll see why it's a disaster. We say that the community, the authorities are not able to respond after an earthquake. So if we don't have that situation, we don't have a disaster. And this is another concept that is very important. We hear about the risk of natural disaster. Again, we come here. The disasters are not natural. We have to say risk of disaster when a natural, exceptional natural event occurs. Okay? The disasters are not natural. It's the human being who generates the disaster when it occupies areas of potential hazard that occur by exceptional natural events. So we have to talk about risk of socio-natural disasters. And here we come to the seismic risk. What is a seismic risk? It's the probability that there are important losses due to effects originated by an earthquake. So here we come to this equation. Here we come. So it means that risk is related to hazard and to vulnerability. For the geologist and for the seismologist, usually risk is equal to hazard or to amenaza, as we say in Spanish, because amenaza is the hazard, is the possibility, again we come to the possibility that an earthquake occurs with a certain dimension and with the probability of occurrence. And then we have vulnerability, and that's what is very much related to architects and engineers. As we talked before, we cannot deal with the hazard. The hazard exists. We cannot touch them. Okay? We cannot, at the moment we can touch the hazard, it means that it's converted into vulnerability, into the area where we can intervene. So the only way of reducing the risk is intervening vulnerability. Okay? We cannot avoid earthquakes, but we have to produce buildings that are not vulnerable and structures that are not vulnerable. So here we have this relation. Yeah? Here we have. So the risk, the seismic risk, is the probability that we can have losses, human and material, in a place that has a very high seismic possibility, and due to the vulnerability of the components. So we will deal with this, and it is, we can see the estimation of the seismic risk, or probably losses, can be expressed because many people ask, how do you deal with that? How do you measure what the risk is? Is considered in monetary units, a number of victims, probably, and amount of physical damages. This is a very nice example that I always use. It was in Ecuador. Geohazard International did a study with the Polytechnical University in the National Polytechnical School in Ecuador. And it is very good for understanding the difference between hazard, that is this part, and vulnerability, and how the relationship between them provides us the tools for finding what the risk could be. Remember that always risk are probabilities. We always deal with uncertainties. In earthquake study or the assessment of risk, we always are dealing with uncertainties. So what they did was they considered 3 possible earthquakes. So it's possible earthquakes. And so one of them was under the city of Quito, one in the ocean, and then one inland. And they are different magnitudes. But what is important with this is not only the magnitude or the location, is who could be affected by this enormous earthquake, or whether the main city can be affected, or whether all these areas can be affected. So we take one of them, and then we have one that is the characteristics of the soil in the city of Quito. And then we get, if we study for the 3 earthquakes, we will have different response from the soil, because according to the possible magnitude, we'll have different intensities. That's another terms that the people really mixed up, intensity and magnitude. There is only one magnitude, and we'll see it afterwards in the El Salvador. So the effects of the earthquake is intensity. And there is only one magnitude for an earthquake, but there are different responses of the soil. So the magnitude is 1, and then we get different possibilities. Then we have all the database of the city with social factors and physical factors. So in the social factors, we'll have all the information regarding the different social economic distribution, and many other aspects we can consider there. And then we have in the physical, we'll have the buildings, we'll have the lifelines, we'll have the location of hospitals. It is very important. The fire stations and so on. So we have this information, and here we get different categories, because, for example, if we get the buildings, the characteristics of buildings, and we will match these characteristics, for example, the different structural systems, the height of the buildings, and all those aspects that we will have in our database. And then we confront this vulnerability with the behavior of the soil, and then here is what we get for the risk. So for this earthquake, we get this behavior of the soil. And then we just took from this information what is on regard to buildings, and then we get here the risk of damages that can occur when the magnitude of an earthquake and this behavior, and only for buildings, this is the risk for that. But it means that we can get as many as we will deal with one of these aspects. Is it clear? So this is we'll deal with the risk management that we've been talking during the whole conference regarding this. And that's the process of identification, analysis, and assessment of probabilities of losses and the secondary effects that we get, and then as the prevention actions corresponding that had to be done. So in this case, we'll have this cycle of the risk management. We get an exceptional event. In this case, we are dealing with an earthquake. And we have the first phase is attention or response. And the 72 first hours is to protect the population and all these actions that we already saw. But the main topic is the protection of the people who survive. What do we do with them? Because when an earthquake occurs, we don't have water, we don't have telephones, we don't have anything. So the people have to survive. And if the population is educated, they should be prepared for resisting those 72 hours. You should have water at home. You need all the flashlights. You need, if you are in a weather, in a strict weather, you need to have blankets. You have many things that you need by yourself, because all the attention, the authorities will deal with the people who are in very bad conditions. You know, everything is to the hospitals to save people. So if you don't have any problem, you are on your own, as you say here in Catalan, tu mateix. So the people have to be prepared, and the communities have to be prepared for that. Then after the 72 hours is another period where you start getting, well, the shelters and temporary shelters, temporary hospitals. And then comes the recovering time. That is when you start preparing the population for getting back to their normal life. And then we have the sustainable development of the community, and you hope that they are still with their normal development until the next event occurs. But that's the moment of the mitigation, and it was also talked about this situation. It means that during all this period, it's not that once the city or the region is recovered, that you wait until the earthquake occurs. It means that from here, that you have the lessons learned, you continue with the mitigation. But what does mitigation mean? In mitigation, we have preparation and prevention. So what is preparation? Preparation means how will you react after a disaster occurs, the event occurs, because that's what we are trying to avoid. Okay? We have to avoid, but we know Now we have to know how to react once we had the event. And it means having all the possibilities of doing the response and the possibilities of recovering. And then we have, what is the prevention? Prevention is all the codes, all the information we need for preparing the city for recovering, and it has to be is in this area that we are dealing with that. And then, oops. And all is mitigation. And it means that is the application of politics in the mitigation of risk of disaster. We are avoiding, but we cannot deal with that. The improvisation is forbidden in that moment. I mean, you cannot wait until the event occurs in order to do all this, because there you increase the disaster. And here there are three different models. I mean, here is what we just saw. Then we have the application of politics. And in here we have this situation. There are countries that when they are in the recovering phase, that they already start with the mitigation, evaluating the lessons. And of course, they will get into the development faster than others. Then we have here is the efficiency of politics of mitigation, that usually they have a small period of mitigation, if any at all. Then the response area will be long, very long. You can see what's going on in Haiti. It was the same year of the Chile earthquake. And Chile was in this model, while we still have IT in this situation. So now we understand why risk is a relationship with hazard and with vulnerability. We only can intervene vulnerability. And then we have a very important factor, that is cost. Cost is socio-political mainly, and economic. It means for the politicians, what does it mean to apply policies for recovering, for mitigation? There are many of them that are only for 3 years in power. You know, what for them is much more important to invest in measurements that the people see what they are doing, and not preparing for who knows when an earthquake will occur. And so it is very important that we consider is, as I say, what is the political, socio-political, economic costs. And now we'll go into the El Salvador earthquakes. So El Salvador is a very small country in Central America, and it is the smallest country in the continent, and is one of the countries that has the highest density of population in the world, and also is a rather poor country. But it's located, as you can see here, within a very active seismic area. We have the Pacific plate that is divided into the Cocos plate, and then the Nazca plate is affecting also this area. The South American plate in here, and the Caribbean plate in this area, and the North American plate in here. So we have the first earthquake was on January 13, 2001. It was located in here, was a magnitude 7.6. And then 1 month after, exactly 1 month after, there was a second earthquake. So if it wasn't an aftershock, it was another earthquake, and if you see, it was a rather large magnitude. So in here is what I was telling you, for the first earthquake, we had only 1 magnitude, and we can see the intensity, that is all this scale, is the Mercalli scale, modified Mercalli scale, that is related to the effects of the earthquake. So we had all these areas, as you can see, the whole country was affected by that. Here we have the information regarding that. And as you can see, this is the earthquake in January 13, and then we had February 13, the second earthquake that affected mostly this area. We can see here the intensity scales. And so it was 1,159 people who died there. And well, you have the information here. We can continue because we are short of time. Okay. So we'll see what were the evaluation of the churches, the methodology. As a matter of fact, the United Nations called a group of experts to go and evaluate the cultural heritage. And the first thing we did was to get together with the Unesco in order to establish what the method will be. And every day we have to join the task force, that is the group of the United Nations, where all the groups intervene, these different experts for the different areas, in order to exchange information. Then we got together with the people of the Patrimony Institute. We established a general objective that was assessment of this cultural patrimony, heritage, sorry. And then we have the particular objectives, that was what was important for the different institutions, and train the people from the Institute of Patrimony, of Heritage, Cultural Heritage. The priorities were for UNESCO was these 2 buildings, and for CEPAL, that is the Economical Commission for Latin America, was the churches, libraries, theaters, etc. Then we developed the method for evaluating. We applied a method that was coming from the Instituto de Ingeniería, the University of Mexico City, the UNAM, and a method I had developed for evaluating hospitals. And so we selected the instruments, and we defined the method, and for the economic patterns. Then we got meetings with the people of the institute, and we developed all the information for getting the technical information, and we established there the economic damages, direct and indirect, and the objects to be evaluated. And then we had different meetings and visiting the different areas, and the parameters used. There was the recognition of the physical effects by the 2 earthquakes, and the classification of all the damages. And then we have here the technical of construction in El Salvador. We had the adobe blocks, the bajareque, that is a combination of mud, straw, and cane. Then we have the tapia, that is mud, pressed mud. And this was very typical, especially in the historic centers, that they were not allowed to touch any of the existing structures. So some of them decided to build a new structure inside. And so we had the performance of two different systems in here. Then we had the stones, and then we have the bricks. So we will go through the most common damages, some of them. So we have here the damages in the walls because they eliminated the central columns, and they eliminated these columns, and they used these structures, and that was what happens where they did that. Was the damage of several churches. This was a very interesting solution, and this church survived without damage. Then we have the typical structure, the wooden structure. And it resisted, as you can see, the walls. This was in the first earthquake, and this was in the second earthquake. So the walls collapsed, but the wooden structure survived in both earthquakes. Then we had this was the cracking of the walls in different ways that we evaluated. All this was in these technical cards that we did for this. So we had here, as you can see, was moving the columns. There was cracking in the bolts and in the domes. We had also damages in this contact area. And here was a typical problem, but it's important. This is the classification of damages, of possible damage that we got there. So this was in the earthquakes, and the damages we had, the frontal part, and here the towers survived in this earthquake. And then we can see how this second didn't survive in the second earthquake. And we had this that we saw before also. And now we go to the conclusions, and we come back here and say, okay, we have seen this, and we have to reinforce the idea that mitigation is what is really important in all this process. In the application of policies for the mitigation of seismic risk, we have to deal with that. We cannot wait until the earthquake occurs, and it is very important to study all these concepts and apply them when we are doing the assessment. Here we come back to this, and now that we have seen all the conference during the day and the previous explanation, we understand much more what's going on with this process. And it's important to know that all this management of risk has to be anticipated, and we cannot wait until the earthquake occurs in order to improvise. Each case, as Professor Falahi said, each case is unique, and it has to be treated appropriately for each one. We can have a methodology, but each case is totally different. So we have to be prepared for each case. I mean, each city, each country has to be treated different to the others. There are different scales for establishing the policies of mitigation, and the topics, as we say, urban planning, buildings, but they have to be treated in the different scales. And development and establishment of policies for the mitigation of the risk of disaster has to be taken by transdisciplinary groups. what means? I mean, we use interdisciplinary, and here we have the definition of the Real Academia Española. It's the study project that requires the participation of several disciplines, you know, but the disciplines go there, but they don't touch each other. Each one deals with its own experience. Multidisciplinary is mostly related to works, and it means that affects several disciplines. An example, the work was the participation of multidisciplinary architects, engineers, and technical personnel. But transdisciplinary means that you have an objective, and each one with his, her experience has to participate in solving that problem. It doesn't matter whether you are an architect, a geologist, a seismologist, a decision maker. There is a project, and all we have to participate in there. It's not a problem that you are an engineer and you deal with your engineering things, and you are a geologist and you do your geological part. It's a whole project, and it has to be affronted. That's transdisciplinary. So thank you very much. So there are some publications related to the topic we talked today. There are many others. You can look for some of my papers in internet, and we can talk about that. Thank you very much. Okay.